Hello, this is Jamey from Stonemaier Games, and I am so excited to be here today with designer Connie Vogelmann, designer of our newest game, Apiary. Connie, thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to let people know a little bit about who you are before we jump into today's list?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. First of all, I just want to say I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited about Apiary. I'm so excited for people to get to see it and to learn about it. And maybe yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. Just for background, this is my first published game. Been really excited to work with Stonemaier on it. My day job is an attorney, so that's not really very exciting. I live in Washington, D.C., and has been sort of making the rounds. I'm also a beekeeper, fairly new to beekeeping, but I did sort of grow up with it in the family. And so that was obviously a really big inspiration for Apiary as well. So that's a little bit about me.
And actually, we're filming this on a Tuesday. And today, on today's design diary, I mentioned that Connie was very kind to send me a little bit of the honey that she got from her bees, and it was really good honey. I'm still enjoying it. It's lasted a long time. It's very good.
Yeah, awesome. It's kind of boomer bust. You either tend to get almost no honey at all, or I think this year is going to be a really big one. We're actually doing our honey harvest this weekend, and I'm expecting to get a good 150 pounds of honey or something like that. So we're going to have a lot more coming up soon.
150 pounds of honey.
From two hives in my backyard. They've just been going absolutely gangbusters this year. So
that's incredible. Well, for those of you who are watching who don't know what Apiary is, there's a lot of information on our website about it. A very brief explanation of the game is that it is a 1 to 5 competitive worker placement, engine building tied to tile placement game with a double-sided board for different player counts. It kind of has 6 different mini game actions on the board, different things that you're doing depending on the strength of your workers. We'll talk a little bit more about the mechanisms in the game as we connect them to our top 10 favorite games that you might enjoy if you like Apiary or vice versa. Anything else that you want to add to let people know if they've never heard of Apiary before, Connie?
No, I don't think so. I mean, just sort of core mechanism is really this sort of worker bumping with sort of the bees age and hibernate. And I think for me, at least, that's absolutely my favorite part of the game. So I'm excited. I'll talk about that quite a bit more as we get into our lists.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I should have mentioned, yeah, the theme is obviously bees. We talked about bees a lot, but it's also space bees. So they're bees that have evolved in terms of their, they've become even more intelligent than they already are, even more technologically advanced, or a lot more technologically advanced, and they've taken to space. And so that is the theme of this game. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're going to jump in here and talk about our top, each of us will do our top 5 favorite games that we think you'll like if you like Apiary or vice versa. So, Connie, what is your number 5 game that you want to talk about today?
Yeah, sure. My number 5 game is obviously a Stonemaier game, and it's one of your designs, and this is Charterstone. And first, I just want to say that I'm not going to actually keep holding this up because otherwise I'm going to get, it's going to be in the way. But anyway, so Charterstone is absolutely a wonderful gaming experience. My game group played through it a couple of times. We really enjoyed it. I'm actually not going to talk about the most direct relationship between Charterstone and Apiary, which is probably the worker bumping, because I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later. One thing I really wanted to touch on and emphasize on about Charterstone is actually the end game condition. So in Charterstone, you have kind of a track that counts down over the course of the game. Players can advance that track by taking specific actions, not any action, but some very specific actions in the game. What I really like about this, and this connects to Apiary in a couple of ways, is sort of twofold. One is you have some sense of when the game's going to end. It kind of changes over time. It's kind of an evolving end game state, but you don't know exactly when it's going to end. So you always need to be kind of adapting to figure out exactly how much longer you have and how to deal with that. The other piece of it that I really, really enjoy is the fact that you as an individual player can have some amount of control over that end game state. If you take some of those actions that really accelerate it, the game will end a little bit more quickly. If you really kind of try to hold back, the game will end a little bit more slowly. And I really kind of like that push-pull that you as an individual player have over that, so you can control what you want your own game to look like. And that's very, very similar to Apiary. The end game condition in Apiary is if you, after you hibernate a certain number of bees, the bees started out at strength 1, they go to 2 to 3 to 4, and then they hibernate. And once they are done hibernating, they go into this hibernation comb. When the hibernation comb is full, the game ends. A lot of Apiary is about kind of manipulating your bees, when and where you place them, when they get bumped, when you decide to speed level them, when you decide to actually, you can bump them down in a couple of ways. And so that really gives players a lot of kind of control over this end game state. And so I really like that kind of push-pull and dynamism. So that's Charterstone and kind of how it relates to Apiary.
And one question that I've got from a few people about how this hibernation works in Apiary is When you have a worker go to the hibernation comb, you have, instead of placing the actual worker miniature, of which there are only 4 per player in the game, instead of placing that in the hibernation comb, you instead place a token representing that worker, and that the worker miniature just goes back to the general supply, representing a new worker that you can gain later.
Yep. And I know we had actually very briefly talked about, do we want to try to have 7 miniatures? And a big part of that was actually sort of those game length considerations, that if somebody's going to breed up to 7 bees and age them all one at a time, so their whole fleet is level 1, level 2, level 3, it actually ends up creating a game that's probably longer than we wanted it to be. So that was part of the reason why I think we went with just the 4 miniatures, was to actually sort of help control that game length a little bit, so that it's a little bit more kind of cabined.
Right. And like Charterstone, also, I think it scales really well. And Charterstone has a track where you start, I believe you start at different places depending on the player count in Charterstone. We have the double-sided board in Apiary, and that you have a few more areas on one side of the board, or definitely more spaces, more areas to scale up to the player count. So I think it scales really well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful example. I'm honored that you brought up Charterstone for this.
Oh yeah, of course.
We should note that Charterstone is a campaign game. Apiary is not a campaign game. It's a, build up your hive, your faction, and then clean it up and try again with something different, a different combination the next time you play. That's Absolutely. Connie's number 5. And I need to take notes on these because we kind of talked about this in advance, but I don't know exactly what Connie's picks are going to be today or what order they'll be in. So I'll note Charterstone here. My number 5 is probably the loosest connection to Apiary, but this game really captures the feel of Apiary to me, and vice versa, and that is Tzolk'in. I think the biggest connection to Apiary that I feel about Tzolk'in is the workers gaining in strength the longer they simply exist. So it's essentially a passive benefit in Tzolk'in, where you put these workers on these dials, and the longer you let the workers remain on the dials, the more powerful they become. That isn't exactly the case in Apiary. If you just leave a worker sitting out on the board, they are not inherently going to gain strength. But every time a worker is bumped, or every time you retrieve workers, they gain strength from when they start at 1 and they go all the way up to 4, and then they hibernate. And you don't really have to do anything. It's one of those passive benefits that feels good. Your workers are simply getting stronger by existing for longer in the game. And so even though it's definitely done differently in Tzolk'in, I think it captures that similar feeling between the two. There are other connections too in Tzolk'in in terms of, and again, they're kind of loose connections, but I think it still captures the feeling. The way the tech tracks work in Tzolk'in, you're leveling up in different abilities. There are ongoing abilities, recruit tiles in Apiary, where you're leveling up in different specific ways. You're making certain actions better. And even as your workers get better, they are making the actions that you select for those workers improve as well. Are there any other strong connections between Tzolk'in and Apiary that I'm forgetting here?
No, I don't think so. Maybe some of the end game buildings or monuments, I think in Tzolk'in, I can't remember exactly what they're called. I think are a little bit similar to the carvings. Right. But yeah, I agree that it's absolutely like the way your workers go around the dials on Tzolk'in is sort of very similar in the sense that they're leveling up. I'll also say personally, Tzolk'in always breaks my brain, because trying to figure out which turns you want to be pulling back workers versus placing them, and how far you want that to be around the wheel is always, it's one of those puzzles that's just absolutely delightful. So.
And that, yeah, you're right. That's a great connection. It's the same puzzle as in Apiary. Is this a turn where you're going to place a worker? And typically you're placing all of your workers in Apiary. You're not pulling them back early, but it's still a tough decision. Like how long are you going to stretch those turns before you have to do a retrieve turn? Or are you going to try to bump yourself? Or are you going to hope that someone else bumps you? There's another game that we'll talk about with those connections. But I'm also glad you brought up the monuments. I'd forgotten to mention those. But in Apiary, there are a bunch of tiles that refill. The development tiles, the recruit tiles, the farm tiles, they refill as you gain them. But there's also, similar to Tzolk'in, a single row of carving tiles, similar to the monuments, where they are set out at the beginning of the game. They are high-level goals that you will rarely get more than 1 or 2 of. You've probably seen players get more, but it's pretty rare.
You could maybe squeeze out 3 if you were really going for it. But yeah, I think 1 or 2 is definitely more common.
So you're really building up to them, and they usually have a big payoff related to something specific you did in the game if you focused on one specific thing. And you can see them from the beginning of the game, and they don't refill. So there is this element of scarcity there and a little bit of tension. Am I going to be able to get this one that I really want?
Absolutely.
So that's Tzolk'in, my number 5. What is your number 4, Connie?
Yeah, my number 4 is Village, which is a little bit of an older game. And I'm actually curious, Jamey, if you or maybe any of the folks who are watching this know of games that did this first, but I'm really interested with Villager. The reason I'm bringing it up is because of this concept that is a dynamic worker pool, that the workers that you start the game with aren't the same workers as the workers that you end the game with. And at least for me, this was the first time that I was introduced to this concept in Village. And so the way that it works in Village is that you have basically a first generation of workers. You start the game with them. Over the course of the game, as you're getting new workers, you get your second generation, your third generation, and your fourth generation. And Village has this really fun time track. So as you take different actions over the course of the game, you advance on this little time track. It's sort of right, this little circle that's right in front of you. Every time you get back to go, one of your workers has to die. And one of the workers that has to die is one of the oldest generation. And so I think there's a couple of really interesting connections to Apiary here. And one is obviously that your worker pool is changing over the course of the game. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, though, is in both games, I think which worker you place onto which action space and when is really crucial throughout the game. So in Village, if you place a worker on a spot, it basically will stay there until that worker dies. And so the decision of whether to place a generation 1 worker or 2 worker or 3 worker there can be really consequential, especially because a little bit similar to the hibernation cone, but a little bit different. Graveyard spots in Village are very limited, and they depend on what action that worker is placed on. So if you have a worker in the church and that worker dies, it goes to sort of its own graveyard spot. And so a lot of it is kind of competing for those spots and figuring out which of your workers to kill when, which all of a sudden a decision that you made 5 or 6 or 7 turns ago about which worker to place on that spot, obviously all of a sudden has really significant consequences later. And I think with Apiary, the way you're trying to be bumped, you're potentially trying to avoid bumping other players. You're trying to take advantage of other workers that players have placed on the board. All of a sudden adds a lot of sort of consequence and significance to which specific worker you place in each spot. So that was sort of the connection that I wanted to make with Village, but excellent game. It's a little bit of an older game, but I think it really, really holds up. So I don't know, Jamey, if you had other thoughts on Village and how it might connect to Apiary.
That is the main connection I was thinking of. It's been a while since I played Village, but I think a few people have brought it up. And as I recall, maybe in one of the early design diaries, in one of the earlier versions of Apiary, were the bees dying? And did you and so we obviously moved away from that. So there's that kind of that morbid theme in Village. What was the original version of that for Apiary?
Yeah, the original was, so it actually used to look a little bit more like a time track in Charterstone, where you basically were just counting down the track until they died. I think the hibernation comb, a little area control puzzle, and the bonuses associated with that were added during development, and I think they're a great addition. But yeah, because if you're, the original version of Apiary was just regular bees. We moved it into space later, which I think is wonderful for about a dozen different reasons. I know some of that's in some of the design diaries, but bees don't live very long. I mean, most bees, and winter bees are a little bit of an exception, but most of your kind of summer honeybees live for about a month at most, a few weeks. And so it seemed sort of very thematic at that point in time that each level of the bee was a week in that bee's life. And so at that point in time they did die, but I think because we could move it to space, we could kind of turn it into this sort of adaptation. They could hibernate instead of actually dying, because as real bees don't actually hibernate. But I really liked that tweak and that addition. Plus it makes it feel a little bit better about like sending your bees off, like, well, now they're just sleeping, they're not actually gone. So
right. Nice. Yeah, I think I think Village is a great comparison. I need to get it back to the table. I haven't played it in forever.
So it's a really good one. I mean, we obviously still have it in our collection, and we cull our collection pretty aggressively. So
nice. So that's Village number 4. My number 4 is Ark Nova, and I put it at number 4 as much as I love this game because there's a lot going on in Ark Nova that is not connected to Apiary, but there is the ecological theme. We're talking about animals here and animals in Apiary, and I can't remember the point in the design process, but at one point you added the hive mats in Apiary, and added specific bonuses on those mats where when you build on top of those portions of the hive mat, and I'll hold up one in a second so we can talk about it, you gain a specific bonus. And the more the deeper that you went into the design, you really themed each hive mat around specific concepts. So it's not like you can get a little bit of everything on every hive mat, which is kind of what happens in Ark Nova until you get to the asymmetric sides when they get more focused. Instead, they're very asymmetric in Apiary, where they're themed after very specific things that you are getting when you're covering them up. I think Apiary does a good job of nudging you in a specific direction without saying you need to do this. But I think those hive mats, it feels good. It always feels good to place a tile, even if there's no bonus underneath it, but it feels extra good to cover up a bonus and get it. And that's something that feels good in Ark Nova too, when you're able to build out your zoo, build out these hex tiles, or They're slightly different in Ark Nova, but they're essentially hex tiles. When you build them out so that they do cover up bonuses, then you get those instant bonuses. So I love that connection in Apiary. I'll hold some up while you talk about your process with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I actually think this is a really good example of like why playtesting and the blind playtesting that Stonemaier does is so wonderful, because of the playtesting, the hive maps were actually something that was suggested by a playtester. Ooh, that is actually my favorite of the hive mats, because you get a free development tile, and those are some of my favorite tiles in the game. When you build on the second to last spot at the top, you get a free one in the last spot, and I absolutely love that. I think that's sort of one that's just that's actually probably the most generic of the ones. The Ware, it's upside down, but it doesn't really matter. And that one you get a little bit of resources and seed card. I think that one is purely resources. And then that one I think is also one of my favorites, because it gives you essentially free breed action. So you get your workforce. So if you're kind of running with that hive, you get essentially a free freebies, and then that one encourages sort of a variety. The Langstroth there encourages a variety of different developments. But yeah, so it was a playtester feedback, and they were like, "Hey, I'd really like hive mats. What do you guys think of that?" And I think they might have actually specifically cited to Ark Nova. I don't remember that for sure. I don't remember the timing, but I know that was a playtester suggestion, and I think it's a really great one. I think it really adds to the game, because before you were just kind of building out freeform. But those hive mats, as Jamey said, really kind of push you in a different direction in a way that I think is really fun and satisfying.
Yeah. Are there any other connections to Ark Nova that I'm not thinking of here?
Yeah, I think that's the main one.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. So that is my number 4, Ark Nova. What is your number 3?
Yeah, my number 3 is Beyond the Sun. And this is a game that we really enjoy. This one wasn't really a direct inspiration for Apiary. It came out a little bit later, but I think it's a very good example of a game where, like, if you like Beyond the Sun, you should maybe check out Apiary. If you've been interested in Apiary and you haven't played Beyond the Sun, I highly recommend it. And a lot of it's just sort of the theme. They're obviously both space games. I think they probably have about a similar weight and complexity. They're also both games. They're both worker placement games, although Beyond the Sun does use actual worker blocking, so it's a little bit different. And there's not any kind of direct combat or fighting. You're not shooting at each other in either game. But there's a couple of elements in particular that I wanted to tease out a little bit. And one of them is sort of exploration. I think both games have a very sort of strong exploration vibe. In Beyond the Sun, you're kind of developing this giant tech tree, and you never really know what you're going to get. So you're always pulling cards from a deck, and then they're permanently added to the board, which are more worker placement spots and more sort of ongoing abilities. And then also the planets, you're kind of colonizing. I think they do use the word colonizing in Beyond the Sun. Let's all assume that they are unpopulated planets, but you are colonizing planets in Beyond the Sun. And those are all very different. So as they come out of the deck, there's a lot of kind of variability and discovery. I think that's very similar to Apiary. I mean, in Apiary, you use a shared queenship to explore these different planets. They sort of flip up. Yeah, I love that miniature. And the planets will come out in a different order. You also have all the tiles that are coming out of the deck. So there's this real sense of exploration and discovery. The other thing that I think is really present in both games is this combination of kind of long-term strategy versus instant adaptation. In Beyond the Sun, the people who are really good at the game, and I am not really good at the game, but people who are very, very good kind of have a plan from the beginning of how they're going to hit these very critical milestones throughout the game, and yet they're still able to adapt as worker placement spots are taken or as new planets or new technologies come out. I think that's very similar in Apiary. Like, you really might be working toward a big carving or towards some of your seed cards or your faction abilities, but then you're always sort of evaluating the board state. And, oh, that person just put that bee on that spot. Can I use that? Can I leverage that? So I think there's this kind of real sense of mix of strategy and tactics in both games as well. So that's Beyond the Sun.
There's one other connection, if you don't mind, that I think is pretty strong between the games. I think Beyond the Sun has a nice sense of positive player interaction, or at least collective player interaction in a competitive game. Because in Beyond the Sun, you're advancing this tech tree, but it is a shared tech tree. All players are able to use this tech tree. And I think you did some really clever things in Apiary to make that are either like neutral player interaction, things that you have to keep an eye on for other players, or just straight up positive player interaction, where as you are exploring these planets and discovering them, you are also pollinating, you're making them better for you and other players to revisit. Also with the dance, I love talking about the dances, but the dance bonus on the convert action, where you are creating a resource conversion, a new one for you and all other players to use for the rest of the game. There's probably some other examples too, but I love those forms of growth on the board, where all players get that expansion, that growth that benefits everybody while they're playing, even in a competitive game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, if somebody flips up a really good advancement in Beyond the Sun, I mean, you can run over to that spot and take it. I mean, because they're already there, they probably get first use of it. But I mean, they are, as you said, building out the board for everyone to take advantage of. So
yeah, that's Beyond the Sun at number 3 for Connie. My number 3 is the other Stonemaier game that we'll mention today, and that is Euphoria. So I think Euphoria has the distinction of being a less complex game than Apiary, and yet it is harder to learn and teach. We put a lot of effort into making Apiary, despite its complexity, really easy to get into and start playing and start taking turns. Euphoria's board is all over the place with stuff that makes it look much more complicated than it is. But the main connection in Euphoria is the worker placement system. In Euphoria, you have some dice that you're placing. The dice represent workers. You're placing them on certain actions where those numbers often matter. Not all the time, but they often matter for where you're placing the workers. And there's a bumping mechanism. It's a game without rounds, so you're either placing a worker or retrieving workers on your turn. And you can, if a worker in most spots, if there is a worker blocking a spot that you want, you can still place a worker there and bump the worker that was there back to that player, back to you, back to an opponent as well. In earlier designs of Euphoria, also, I kind of did exactly what you ended up doing with Apiary, where the workers would get smarter. The idea is, if I'm working on a farm in this dystopia and Connie comes over and bumps me off that spot, she might spread a little rumor to me about this dystopia that we're in. And so I might gain a little information, a little intelligence. That worker might gain a little intelligence. But I found on dice that was a D6 dice in particular, it was kind of fiddly to adjust them. And because we weren't actually rolling the dice in Euphoria and I had the dice, kind of took some fun out of the game. So I added this dice rolling mechanism. I used the numbers in a different way in terms of looking at how much workers know about the dystopia. But I really like in Apiary that the workers aren't dice. You are simply leveling them up. You're turning them and adjusting their intelligence. But yeah, there's that bumping. There's the gaining in strength in Apiary that's connected to Euphoria. I think if people like Euphoria, they will almost certainly like Apiary. I'll pull out some workers here if you want to mention anything else, any other connections there that I'm forgetting.
No, not at all. I'll just say that I do absolutely love the sort of dice or worker bumping mechanisms in these games. I mean, I think first Euphoria and then Charterstone, and I know some of the like Shem Phillips games aren't quite doing that, but they're certainly similar ways to manipulate workers. Just because there's something about some of the more traditional worker placement games, if a spot is just blocked, it's a little bit disheartening. I mean, it feels very like you're very thwarted. Whereas I think the bumping adds both a positive element, but also oh no, can I do this? Can I bump this worker back to them? And I think that's a much more interesting decision space, at least for me. So I'm really, really excited to be exploring it in another game. So
yeah. And there are also some places in Apiary where having other workers at the action matters as well. I think there's a few of those in Euphoria too, where Connie may have placed a 2 strength worker on the Explorer action, and that extends the range of the queenship if I place a worker there, because it's the strength of my worker plus her worker. And so again, that's kind of that positive player interaction element. And optimizing that moment. Like I may have planned something else for my turn. You mentioned this a second ago, taking advantage of those moments and being a little tactical. I may have planned something else, but if Connie placed a 4 value worker on an action, I might really want to also take that action at that time while that worker is still there.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Connie, what is your number 2 favorite game or game that you'd recommend for someone?
Yeah, my number 2 favorite game is Glass Road, and this is a Uwe Rosenberg game that, if I may get on a soapbox for just a moment here, I think it's so underrated. I absolutely love this game. I don't know why people don't seem to enjoy it more than they do. I think it's just an excellent bang for your buck. It's an easy to teach game. It's pretty short, but I think it really punches above its weight class in terms of decision making. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about with Glass Road is the tableau building. So in Glass Road, a big part of what you're doing is you are putting tiles onto an individual player board. And there are 3 types of tiles. They're all buildings. I think they're just called immediate, ongoing, and end game. I don't think they have any kind of creative names, although I don't remember. But those are obviously the sort of inspiration for the recruits, the developments, and the carvings in Apiary. And there's a couple of sort of elements beyond just the tile placement that I think started in Glass Road and that really kind of carried all the way through to the final version of Apiary. And one is the adjacency requirements. There's a lot of things in Glass Road that depends on exactly specifically where you place that tile. You get to do something for each adjacent item, or if it's adjacent to something, you get to do something special. So there's that kind of adjacency component. And Glass Road does use rectangular pieces, not hexes. So I think hexes actually even opens up that space a little bit more because you just have more adjacent sides. But then the other thing that I really love about Glass Road that I think we've transferred into Apiary is just you have these big stacks of tiles, and they always come out in different orders and different combinations. And so every game is just going to feel different, and it just feels like you're always discovering slightly new combinations and new ways to play. And so that's something that I absolutely love about Glass Road. Yeah, and I think that I think that is in Apiary as well, because you're not going to see every tile in every game, and they're certainly not going to come out in the same order in the same combinations. So that's Glass Road.
I wish I could add more to this, but it's been a long time since I played Glass Road. I need to play it again. And when I think most about Glass Road, I think about the action selection mechanism, which I believe is simultaneous. You select a role, and that is not something that's an apiary, but it's a neat mechanism too.
It's absolutely cool. And I absolutely love the dials too, the resource generation in Glass Road. So there's 2 dials, and basically if you get enough resources on each wheel, it will automatically generate one of the advanced resources or the refined resources, which is, I think, a really interesting puzzle, because a lot of times you'll actually very consciously want to keep one resource low to keep that wheel locked in place, because as soon as you generate that resource, the wheel will automatically turn. And I think that's just such a clever puzzle. I absolutely love it, but not related at all to apiary.
Yeah, but yeah, a great mechanism to talk about. That's Glass Road. Connie is number 2. My number 2 is the one that I don't own, but it is on Board Game Arena, and that is Teotihuacan. This is a game in the Tzolk'in series of games where you are moving workers around a big rondel, a rondel of actions where the number of pips on your workers matters. This is very similar to the strength mechanism of the workers in Apiary. In Teotihuacan, there's kind of these big spreadsheety charts on each action to show you exactly what you're getting based on the value of those workers. I think the apiary board is a little bit more streamlined, but that complexity in Teotihuacan is fun too, to see all those the different things that you can get depending on what strength your worker is by the time it gets to a certain action. And there's also, I should have looked up this in advance, but there is a worker kind of retirement mechanism too in Teotihuacan. After, it's either when they reach 6 or after they would go beyond 6. Do you remember which one it is?
I don't remember which one it is. I think they call it ascending, right, in the game, something like that. But yeah. And I think that's obviously a very basic mechanism.
Yeah, like the timing of that. I like that it's similar to what you did in Apiary. I like that it is a moment of loss a little bit. You're losing this very powerful worker, but you're also gaining this permanent place in Apiary in the hybridation comb, and a very important instant benefit, or it can be very important depending on how early you got there. And Teotihuacan does something different. It is similar, where you're getting a powerful benefit. You might even be moving up a track when that happens too. So there's kind of a sense of permanent gain there. Yeah,
absolutely. I honestly haven't played that one in quite a while, but I need to get it back to the table. But I remember I actually started working on Apiary before it came out, and saw it, and I was like, oh no, it's the same thing, and then played it. And they're obviously very, very different games, but I just love that worker aging and ascension mechanism. So.
Yeah, so that's my number 2. Let's get to our number 1s. What is your number 1? And I'm also curious, not only the connection to it, but why you chose it as the number 1 slot here.
Yes, absolutely. So my number 1 is the Voyages of Marco Polo, specifically the first one. But I guess it doesn't really matter. But anyway, Voyages of Marco Polo, the reason it's number 1 is sort of twofold. And first, is one of my favorite games of all time. I absolutely love it. But second of all, it is probably the most direct influence on Apiary and on the kind of concept for Apiary, which is funny because I don't actually know how much of that carried through to the final game. Some of the earlier versions of Apiary had a map that you were exploring that felt much more like the map that you're exploring in Marco Polo. There was also a cost element in Apiary. For a while, we had what was called V-Bucks. Again, the theme was very loose, but if you went to a place where somebody else already was, you had to pay money to the bank, essentially, which is very similar to Marco Polo. But I think there's a couple of kind of core concepts and a couple of feelings, sort of ways that the game feels that are very sort of similar and still related, even though some of the core mechanisms are quite a bit different. So the way Marco Polo works, if folks haven't played it, is you roll a set of 5 dice at the beginning of every round. Those are your workers. You're placing those onto the board. The strength of those dice, or the number on the dice, determines the strength of the action. However, if you ever go to a spot where somebody has already been, and that's very common because there aren't very many worker placement spots in the game, you have to pay $1 per pip. And so it sort of sets up this real tension of, you want the high dice because you want the strong actions, but you want the low dice because you can still take the action later on in the round. And so I think that idea of sort of worker strengths and placing different workers on different spaces and that having a different effect definitely carried through. The other thing that I wanted to talk about are sort of the faction abilities. So Marco Polo is known for having like sledgehammer strength faction abilities that just break the fundamental rules of the game. I mean, one of the faction abilities in that game, you just don't roll your dice. Another one, you don't pay to go on to a spot that somebody else has been on, etc. The faction abilities in Apiary are obviously much more minor. They're much more nudges, but that was something that I wanted to have in the game because I do think it's really important from a replayability standpoint to just kind of give people slightly different incentives every game, because otherwise I think you can very easily fall into a pattern where the first action is always this and the second action is always that. And so you kind of have the first, half of your game structured already. And I think that's a lot less interesting puzzle than, oh, I got this new faction, it's pushing me in a slightly different direction. And so I think that that's sort of an important element of it. The other thing that I think really carried through from Marco Polo to Apiary is the sense of being able to break the rules. Whenever you use a faction ability in Marco Polo, you are just breaking a very fundamental rule of the game, and it feels great. Like when you're a player, you're like, oh man, I just broke this rule. It felt wonderful. And I think that really carries through to Apiary, but mostly through the tiles and the cards, more so than specifically the factions. As we were talking about with this leveling and aging of bees, I mean, there are cards and tiles in Apiary that will say, let you pull back a bee without retiring it, or even decrease the strength of a bee, or speed increase the strength of it. And so like it allows you a lot of ways to get those extra strength 4 actions. And those strength 4 actions are so juicy that every time you can pull it off, you get the sort of real hit of like, yes, I did something good. I cheated the system. And I think that feels really, really good. So anyway, that's kind of Marco Polo. As I said, it's my number 1 on my list, both because I absolutely love the game and because it was the primary inspiration for Apiary. Again, even though the final game looks so different.
I've found that I love asymmetry in games. I love the different levels, and Marco Polo, you're right, it's really, really high levels of asymmetry. I admire that. I appreciate that. I have a lot of fun with it. I've found that I think in the games that we publish, I'm leaning more and more towards the nudge at the beginning, a little bit of asymmetry, but then earned asymmetry. And I think you do that so well in Apiary. Like you're choosing the asymmetry as you go, and it's often related to engine building. You mentioned that the recruit tiles are one of them. The seed cards give you like one-time asymmetry, a one-time powerful thing that feels really, really good. And also you can upgrade your faction tiles. There's a starting side, and then there is an upgraded side, and that's a choice. You don't have to do that every game. You might not do that, but the upgraded side is better. You're earning that stronger asymmetry on the back if you choose to pursue it. I really like what you did with that you were choosing this path of asymmetry throughout the game, and that it's variable because you don't, the recruit tiles are going to come up in different orders. Sometimes you won't see certain recruit tiles in the game, so it's going to be different from game to game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think they can combine together in interesting ways too. I mean, there's definitely some where you can kind of put together 2 things in a way that makes an action feel almost free. And that's always really exciting as well.
Yeah. So there's Voyages of Marco Polo as Connie's number 1. My number 1 is Honey Buzz. I really had no preface for it because it is such a strong connection for me between this and Apiary. This is fully a kind of well, actually, it's not even entirely a real world bee theme. You can see they're kind of anthropomorphic animals in this game, but these are bees on Earth opposed to bees in space. And in Honey Buzz, it is also a worker placement game. Worker placement is done very differently in this game, but it is a worker placement game. It is also a hive building game with engine building. But it's interesting to me that you did all these things differently in Apiary, and as Paul did them very differently in Honey Buzz. I think both games belong in the collection of someone who enjoys bees and enjoys that sense of progression in a game and enjoys the kind of the joy and simplicity of worker placement. Honey Buzz was almost the game that made me hesitant to publish Apiary because I was like, okay, this game already exists that is about bees, that is strongly themed from day one, from the ground up about bees, and it has all those elements of engine building, hive building, and worker placement. But after I saw what you did with Apiary and saw how different it was, and that you were open to putting a little bit of a speculative twist on it in these bees going to space, I was open to it. And also, I ended up loving working with Connie. Paul, the designer of Honey Buzz, is one of my friends. I play disc golf with Paul, so I love that my 2 favorite bee theme games are made by wonderful people. So I hope people who try Honey Buzz, who love Honey Buzz, will try Apiary, and vice versa. If you've never played Honey Buzz and you enjoy Apiary, I think you'll really enjoy this game too.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one quick thing to add, though, I do think it's really interesting how, in some ways, they're both worker placement games, but they both approached bees a little bit differently, because it seems like very unreasonable that a bee is going to block a worker placement spot that's not really very thematic. And so, what Apiary does is obviously the bumping, as we've talked about, and then what Honey Buzz does is I believe you need to place one more worker than the last person. And so the spots still aren't blocked, but there's kind of that like jockeying for position, and I really, really like that. I'll also mention too, I really love Honey Buzz has a very spatial, thinky puzzle on how to orient the tiles in a way that I think is very different than Apiary, but I think it's really, really satisfying when you can get like one of your perfect, hive rings to work out perfectly. So
Yeah, you're right. There's a great spatial puzzle as to exactly which tiles you gain and where you place them in your hive in Honeybuzz. I think there's still also a good spatial puzzle in Apiary too. Many of the starter factions give you a little puzzle of here's a good place to place certain types of tiles. Certain tiles come out and want that adjacency. But you're right, it's a core part of every decision that you make in Honeybuzz.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So these are our 10 games that we'd recommend if you enjoy Apiary. This video is going to come out before anyone has played Apiary, so it works the other way in this case. If you enjoy any of these games, or especially a couple of these games, I think you'll have a lot of fun with Apiary, and I hope you give it a try. Connie, thank you so much for your time, for coming up with this list and thinking about it, and for designing Apiary. It's been a pleasure to work with you on it.
Well, yeah, you too. And thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. If you have any questions in the comments below, or if you can see any other connections between Apiary and other games, let us know in the comments, and I'll talk to you there. Thanks.